So now we're up to making the turbo manifold. So first thing we need to do is we need to attach these flanges to the header tubes, and how we're going to do that is part off a bit of tube and then weld a band around here, because if you may know that the vrod has a slip flange like this so that it floats, so we obviously need something that's going to hold the flange on. So we put a bit of tube around here, bit of a band that can slide up against it, then we can bolt the header to the block. So now we're up to the fun part, making the turbo manifold. As you can see, it goes in there like that. So I'll show you how we're going to retain it to the motor. So what we're going to use is a ring like this, and I've just used a bit of 2.5 inch tube, cut it down, and then we end up slipping over the end. Reason being why we need that ring is because, as you can see, the flange has nothing to retain to, it will just come straight off. So we end up making something that looks like this, and the flange has nowhere to go after that. So hopefully that all makes sense, and clamp it up to the motor. Pretty easy, just fuse weld it on, good to go. Here we have it, hopefully it makes sense now. So what we can do is bolt into the motor and start mapping out our tubing and start running it up towards the turbo. As you can see, these are the retaining rings, they slide up there. And if you look on the back of these flanges, they've got a recess there, and that's what the retaining ring sits in, and that's what locates it. And sits like that. So there's no way for that tube to slip out of the motor. So now we need to bolt these to the motor and start joining all the tubes. So here goes our header pipes all done now. I didn't record this process because it's just cut, weld, there's nothing interesting. So here goes the rear one, obviously. There goes the front one, got a bit of clearance out there. Obviously we're going to need to protect it. And as you can see, we've, hopefully from this angle here, you can see it's molded towards the block. We could have come straight out here like a bit of scaff tube, but it wouldn't have looked nice. So I thought I might as well mold the block, give it a bit of shape. Spend that extra half an hour or so. So yeah, that's how it looks. Here goes our manifold all tacked up. It wasn't worth recording this process, it's just a lot of cutting and welding, and it's sort of taking a lot of time trying to explain everything as we go, but nonetheless you can see the basic fundamentals. Pretty simple setup. But what happened was, when I originally done this, I actually came up across here because I was trying to give it some shape back down there, but I fully forgot about it, and I put the body back on afterwards, and then I thought it's actually going to sit up where the seats are, so I actually had to tuck it down low so it all sits underneath the seats. So as you can see, it molds against the block. We done that design instead. It's nice and tight through there. Here goes rear one, obviously. So just use a bit of 2-inch tube. Here goes our collector. So what we're going to do now is hang the turbo, position it exactly central in the back of the card here, and then we can link it all up, and then once the diff's in, we can make the exhaust and the mufflers and stuff, and then we can make a plenum. Ended up machining the V-band flange. As you can see, they're quite a big raw thickness, probably about 7 or so mil. So why we've done that is for A, it'll be a lot easier to weld than trying to go 7 mil to this 2 mil. And it recesses in there because I needed a bit more clearance, so I thought I might as well recess it in there. And it's also tapered. See that taper? So it's going to have a smooth transition. So you can see there, nice smooth transition. Looks good. What do we have going on here? Bit of business in the front, party out the back with the old turbo hanging out the back now. So as you would have seen on Instagram, it took a few revisions to get it to sit exactly where we wanted to. So as you can see, end placement is center of the chassis. We had it twisted 90 degrees, we had it on an angle. Nothing really looked that great on it once the body was on it. So here we have our final resting place. As you can see, all the tube work. The wastegate pipe took a couple of attempts as well. Nonetheless, we've got clearance for the chain, pretty close against the sprocket, but still enough to make a belt guard to go over the top and not quite hit that. So yeah, it took a while. It wasn't worth recording it. It's just like anything really, a lot of cutting and welding. We could have brought the turbo back further, but the reason why I didn't is because if we had to have this down pipe hanging over this cross member here, we had to make like a big S-bend and just wouldn't have flowed right the down pipe. So it was worth bringing it out slightly. And we have a nicer a smoother looking down pipe. So it's basically all the tube work done now. Quite like how it all tucks up against the motor, flows well. Happy with how that little collector there turned out too. So it's basically the turbo mounted, so now we can move back onto the diff. Sprockets are now here, so what we're going to do now is machine the taper on them. That's just to give us our width we need, because these are cut out of 10mm plate and it's just under 9mm the thickness we need for our 530 chain. previous slide, we ended up cutting these off, then we threw them in the sandblaster, but didn't notice because the grease marks from my hand. So what we're going to do now is machine this down so we can put it into the end of our axle, and that'll be a complete axle. As you can see, we've got our RX8 stub shaft there, and then we'll press them into there and weld them on. Getting pretty close to being able to assemble this rear end now. Here goes the hubs we all machined up. You'll swear they're a billet item, but that's one thing I love about engineering. You can either make something out of nothing, or you can repurpose stuff like this. So what we need to do now is put this back in the cart, align the sprocket, get everything nice and true. Then we can get our exact length we need for each axle. Put the axles back in the lathe, part them off to their desired length, put a little weld prep on there, machine a weld prep on, chuck them in the press the end of the hub in, weld them up, and then we have complete axles. So what we're up to now, we're going to part the axles off to our length we need them, and we're going to press in the hubs, weld them all up, and that will be the axles completed. Here goes the axles all completed. So as you can see, we're pressing the RX8 stubs, pressing the flanges, and also press the bearings on. So now we can throw them in the cart. We're about to make the links, so roughly got the laser at the base of these bearings here, and as you can see, that's where it's going to land on the chassis. But that's at its lowered ride height, so we need to actually lift it up to its close enough ride height, and then we can deduct. Sorry, you might see it on the side. There we could deduct some height from there and drop it down a bit. So when it's at its ride height, it's not on a massively silly angle. So we made the start on our links. It wasn't worth recording this as well because it's just simply cut some tube, weld onto the end really. So we machined up our little spacers so we can tap them into the end now. So hopefully this makes a bit more sense now. We've got a bolt through it, so you can see this is a pass through. This one has a thread, so the section here is going to be the chassis rail, and then we made this little pedestal thing here for the bearings to sit on. And it's quite high because I allowed for enough room for enough threads and the nut to go underneath here, so we've got some clearance on this link, and then we'll weld it all up. We'll shape it up later on to make it look a bit nicer, but for now that's how it's all going to work, so it should all start making sense. We've drilled the holes out for the weld on bosses now. Got a bolt in there so it's running nice and parallel with the chassis rail, so all we need to do is weld it in. So welded in both sides now. This will actually slip quite far up, but that's actually quite a short arm. So what we need to do now is put the body back on, so then we can get the center of the wheel arch. Once we get that, then we can cut these to length. That'll basically be the lower arms done. And also, it should start making sense now. Try and hold it at the same time. So the shock is actually going to be mounted off this lower arm as well, and probably up to that support bar there on the motor. We've now mocked the diff back up in there. What we're trying to achieve is the length of the lower control arm, so all we needed to do was put the body back on there and center the wheel within the wheel arch there, and that's determining our length of our control arms. A few other little bits and pieces we've got for the car. We've got some Haltech coils, our dry-bar wires turned up as well, and also we're going to be using an RX8 throttle pedal. So that's basically going to be the end of this video. So next round, hopefully we mount the shocks, possibly make an exhaust. I want to get all the hard fabrication stuff out of the way first, weld everything out, and then we can move on to making a plenum and doing our charge pipe and whatnot.